And for more, we're joined now on the show by John Quinley. He's Director of Fortify Rights, a human rights advocacy group focused primarily on Myanmar. John, thank you very much for joining us. I want to start by, asking you a more expansive question about human rights. We know about the numbers, and they are staggering compared to, before the coup in Myanmar, was, if you like, the gem of Southeast Asia. My question to you is whether or not the junta should be held responsible, for the dire situation in the country right now.
Yeah, thanks for having me on today. I believe the military should be held accountable, those with command and control responsibility that are responsible for the crimes that you touched on your show. These crimes include war crimes and crimes against humanity. Fortify Rights, the organization that I work for, is a human rights organization, and we've been documenting these crimes over the last 3 years and even during previous governments in Myanmar. The Myanmar military took over in what they believed was going to be a swift military coup. But 3 years on, you have an armed resistance against the Myanmar military. You have peaceful resistance against the Myanmar military. So right now you have an attempted and failed coup. But that doesn't mean that the Myanmar military isn't succeeding in displacing large communities, in killings, in torture, in arbitrary arrest. These rise to the crimes against humanity. And in ethnic states, you have, shelling, airstrikes, indiscriminate attacks on civilian populations, and large-scale displacement. They're also blocking access to humanitarian aid for groups working in the country or groups working along the border. So getting services to displaced communities is becoming more and more difficult because the junta is actively trying to block that aid.
Speaking of that aid, John, since the coup in 2021, have the humanitarian response and provision of aid scaled up enough to deal with the situation on the ground? I mean, what do people need the most right now?
Yeah, I mean, people need clothes, people need shelter, people need food, people need access to medical care. Humanitarian organizations and governments worldwide should be supporting civil society organizations working along the border, working inside the country to fund them so they can get aid to hard-to-reach communities. A lot of these communities are quite rural. They're active conflict zones. For example, there's large displacement now in Rakhine State, which borders Bangladesh. And there's an ongoing conflict between the Arakan Army and Myanmar military in Rakhine State. The Myanmar military was shelling villages over the last few days, and this has caused thousands of people to be displaced in Butidong Township in Rakhine State. So there needs to be, really urgent and unfettered aid access to that area for the displaced communities. There's also quite a few wounded and injured. They need medical care. So I think donor governments, the UN, and others should be supporting civil society groups that can actually get aid to these hard-to-reach areas. Myanmar has been under previous military dictatorships, and the civil society groups in the country actually understand how to navigate the complex environments. And so they're best placed to be able to provide the aid to their own communities.
John, I want to ask you about the fate of political prisoners in the country right now. The Assistance Association for Political Prisoners says nearly 20,000 remain in detention in Myanmar. Can you tell us about ongoing efforts to secure their release and whether or not sanctions are working? Obviously, the U.S. just slapped new ones on the country and individuals and entities.
Yeah, there's thousands of people still detained, and AAPP is a great local human rights organization documenting the rest of civilian population. Many of the arrests are ongoing. People are put away for 3 years, 10 years. The junta is going after any kind of dissent. So people that are activists, peaceful protesters, armed defense force members, family members now, if they can't find the human rights defender, they'll go after their family. So they'll jail mothers, sisters, brothers for the actions of their relatives. I think sanctions are not a silver bullet, but governments worldwide should be enacting sanctions against entities that are fueling the Myanmar military. This includes jet fuel. There should be a global arms embargo. People should have travel bans. And also, we need to think about ongoing accountability mechanisms. Perpetrators in the future should be held to justice. If there is ongoing impunity, then these crimes will happen again. I was a part of documenting the Rohingya genocide back in 2016, 2017. If the world had actually held Min Aung Hlaing, who was the leader of the military during the Rohingya genocide, if they would have held him accountable, then you wouldn't have the military coup that happened 3 years ago. So impunity is, has to be stopped immediately, and perpetrators must be held accountable. Activist families are working with communities to try to get prison visits, try to get, Myanmar lawyers are trying to get the release of political prisoners, but political prisoners in Myanmar, need support, and they need to be immediately released. The government, the Myanmar junta has done some amnesties in the last year of political prisoners, but it's basically a drop in the bucket. And it's because the prisons are overcrowded, unsanitary. They've set up new prisons throughout the country, detention centers. We've documented torture and ill treatment in those detention centers. This includes beatings, long-term deprivation of food, and other things in those kind of detention facilities.
Yeah, John, since the military coup, your organization has actively pursued legal action against Myanmar's military in foreign courts. But with all these hurdles and successful prosecutions, what's keeping Fortify Rights pushing for this? And is there a real shot at making them accountable?
Yeah, we remain hopeful in the courageous human rights defenders that we work alongside. We're an international human rights group, so we accompany and support the national organizations working in the country. We document human rights violations with them. We try to provide them technical support, protection. So we're hopeful because the Myanmar people are hopeful, and they're actively resisting the military junta. So we're hopeful that Min Aung Hlaing and other senior military and police officers will be held accountable in international court or ad hoc tribunal. We would call for member states to refer the situation in Myanmar to the ICC under Article 14. We support and support the lawyers at the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, that are bringing a genocide case on state crime. And we ourselves have opened a universal jurisdiction case, and others have in countries around the world. Unfortunately, our universal jurisdiction case was rejected, but we plan on resubmitting in other jurisdictions. And so these kind of pushes for international accountability are really important. They're long-term acts of trying to hold perpetrators to justice, but they're needed now more than ever.
All right, John, thank you. We got to go. Thank you for the work you're doing as well. Very important work. We've been speaking to John Quinley, Director of Fortify Rights, a human rights advocacy group focused primarily on Myanmar.